answer some questions. So we're going to imagine that these two paddles here are actually a kayak. If I was laying in my kayak, or laying in the water rather, like this, what would this particular maneuver be called?
Static.
Static brace, balance brace. Yeah? What would you guys prefer calling it? Static brace or balance brace?
Balance brace.
Balance brace, because you're balancing, right? You're not necessarily static. Okay? So some of the key fundamentals to doing a static brace are having the body perpendicular to the kayak. It's very, very important. Many people, when they do this, they're actually right back here. That does not necessarily mean it's wrong. It just means that if you're perpendicular, that's the ideal place to actually be doing the static brace. What might some of those reasons be? Anybody know the answer to that?
Personal flexibility.
Yeah, well, flexibility can sometimes limit you to getting to perpendicular, but being perpendicular, why is that the best place?
Where you get more
Just
fluctuation,
lever arm.
you have for-
Your leverage.
Biggest lever,
you know.
you're gonna get more flexibility.
Yeah, you've got greater leverage when your body is actually perpendicular to the kayak like this. There's another reason why this is a great spot to be, and that is because now your swing rate to the back deck is greater than it is if you were back here. Okay, so from here I've only got this much swing rate, and from here I've got a full range of swing rate. And when I say swing rate, I don't mean swinging your body to the back deck necessarily. It's the swing rate, if you will, in your hips. So the further you bring yourself out, the more you're opening up your hips, you're giving yourself that greater range of motion to get to the back deck. Does that make sense? Good. Okay, so some of the key elements to doing a static brace. It's very much like floating on your back in a pool. So some of those things are, you want to arch your back, you want to sort of puff your chest out a little bit. Okay, and your head, you want to keep your head nice and relaxed. Okay, if you're laying on your back in a pool and you're floating on your back, what happens when you tense up? Down you go. So you need to really relax your upper body, be very, very relaxed. Okay, and something we talked about this morning was the disconnection of energy between the upper body and the lower body. When we're in this particular position, our upper body is very relaxed, because if it's not, we're going to sink. And our legs are actually working quite hard to push the kayak away. So the top leg in this position is pushing the kayak this direction, and the bottom one is lifting, so our legs are doing this. Does that make sense to everybody? Okay, so we're effectively pushing the kayak away from us. But there's constant pressure holding that kayak away. So when you do that, when you're pushing your legs with such force like that, there's a tendency for that energy to want to travel up the body. So you really have to think about that disconnection of energy between the upper body and the lower body. And this includes almost all of the roles actually in the list, with exception to the stalling roles. You need to be able to differentiate the energy between the upper body and the lower body. Because a lot of times, again, when you start using your legs like this, there's a tendency for that energy to want to run up the upper body. Okay? So the static brace is a really, really good technique to practice, and I often practice this. I practice this quite often, and I'll come out to perpendicular, and I'll sort of sway back and forth to try to find that perfect area. Okay. So some of the other things is when you go into a static brace. Some of the things I was noticing today on the water, when people were going into a static brace, they were just sort of dropping off the side of the kayak and flopping into the water, and it was kind of this ungraceful splash, and down they went, and then they popped back up to the surface. Okay? When you go into a static brace, the ideal way to do this is to lay right onto the back deck, and then as you slide out, you literally want your head to drop off the side of the kayak and putting your head into a floating position first. Okay? So rather than lifting your head up and placing it into the water, you want to literally drop it off the back deck, put your head into a floating position first, and as you start to come out, you want to focus on your lead shoulder getting into the water as soon as possible, so that you're not coming in like this. You want that shoulder to get into the water as soon as possible. Okay? So for some people, they can't get perpendicular. So one of the things that I often get them to do is simply put your hand underneath the back deck, and by doing that, you can push this shoulder down. Does that make sense to everybody when I say that? Okay, so that's one way that you can actually get that shoulder down if it's starting to lift up. Because obviously the more you start going perpendicular, the more those shoulders are wanting to lift up. Now obviously when you're doing a roll, you can't be putting your hand underneath the kayak and holding yourself into that position. But while you're training and trying to teach your body where that ideal place is, that's one way of getting yourself into that position. So think about it like stretching or like yoga. You're trying to get into a position and you're trying to just get that a little bit more and hold it for 30 seconds. Okay, so that's one way to actually train your body to get out to perpendiculars, to actually use the stern of the kayak to do that. Okay? So again, when you're going into this position, as soon as you drop your head off the back deck, that's when you're going to activate your legs. Some people were saying today, well, don't I just keep my legs relaxed when I'm in this position? They shouldn't be relaxed at all. They should be working at all times. Okay? In fact, when I'm teaching this, if there was a kayak sitting here right now and I had somebody in it, while they're laying on the water, I should be able to push on that kayak like I'm trying to push it on top of them, and I'm just pushing them across the surface of the water, and they're not actually sinking because they're effectively using their legs. If they weren't using their legs and I did that, they go down quite quickly. Okay? So that's pretty much, that's it for really for the static brace, is you want to get yourself out to perpendicular and then back. And when you come back, it's the exact same, only in reverse. So as you come back, you get this lead shoulder over the edge of the kayak. And when you come to the back deck with your head, I often tell people, think about hitting your ear on the side of the kayak. So rather than trying to lift your head up onto the back deck, think about actually hitting your ear on the side of the kayak before you come up. I get a lot of kayakers that are more on an expert level that just want refinements with their roll, and if it's a layback roll that they're actually working on, that's generally what it is even they think that they're keeping their head back the entire time, but once they get to this point, something in their brain says, I have to lift my head up to get it onto the back deck. So there's this slight lift in the neck where you really don't want that slight lift at all. You really want to keep your head back at all times. And obviously, if you do it too fast, you're going to knock yourself out. So you got to be very careful doing that. Okay, so the very next step, this is usually the very first exercise I'll work on with a beginner, is get them into that floating position. Okay. The next step after this, what we work on is we work on getting the kayak on top of them into a loaded position. But before we do that, I'm going to talk about what we're actually doing with the legs. And this is called the load drive concept. So a load drive concept, does everybody know what a hip snap is? Yeah? Yeah. Can everybody sit on the ground with their feet in front of them like this? And everybody sit on the ground like this. And I want you to show me what a hip snap looks like. So show me a hip snap. What does a hip snap look like? Yeah. Don't add that load drive concept like I taught you earlier. I know that'll naturally come now. But a hip snap is you're just sort of snapping the hip up. So often when we're taught how to roll, we're taught to use a hip snap. Okay? So that would be considered a hip snap. And then they started to add in, well, you need to actually lift the leg. So if you lift the leg, you can actually lift the kayak up with it. So if you add the leg into that hip snap, now we're doing something like this. Okay, and that's effective. You can actually roll a kayak quite well if you do a hip snap and you lift the leg. Okay, now a load drive concept is a little different. Instead of just doing this, we're actually loading up the kayak and then we're throwing the kayak around. Okay, so loading it up and throwing it around. Loading it up and throwing it around. Okay, so that's very much like throwing a baseball. If I was to just lift the leg or do a hip snap, that's like throwing a baseball from here forward. If I threw a baseball like this, obviously it's not going to go very far. Okay? But if I load up that baseball and I throw it, I'll probably get 10 times the distance or 10 times the power. Okay? So that same concept applies to rolling kayak. If you can load up your legs and throw your legs around, you can get a lot of power out of your legs to roll kayak. And that, in theory, is how you do the hardest rolls in the lift, is by using the load drive concept. So you can get away with just using one leg or using a hip snap if you only want to make it maybe a third of the way through the list. But if you're plateauing and you can't figure out why you're getting to the top of the list, it's probably because you're not using your legs effectively. Many of us, when we're watching somebody roll, we don't see that. because it's sort of hidden inside the kayak. But that's really the secret, if you will, to doing the hardest rolls, is to actually use your legs very effectively. But just like throwing a baseball, the first time you went and threw a baseball, it didn't sail through the air and go 100 feet. It probably went thump off to the side. So it's going to take some practice to actually get that timing. Okay, so it's very much the same as rolling a kayak. Okay, so that's the load drive concept. Is there any questions about that load drive?
James, I have one.
Yeah, sure.
Are you using that same concept both for a layback and a forward finishing?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yes,
I just
absolutely. And it becomes more crucial to use that load drive concept when you're doing forward finish rolls.
Okay.
Okay? But it will be a slightly different feel in the legs. Obviously, if you're sitting forward doing this with your legs, it's going to be there's a lot more power than when you're laid back. When you're sort of contorted and laying back trying to do this with your legs, it's a lot harder when you're doing laid back rolls. Forward finish rolls, you're sitting forward, and you can really crank those legs. And you got a lot more power, and it's a different muscle group, if you will. Okay, so I'm going to go back to our static brace. So from the static brace position, this is exercise 2 that I'll generally work on with people for layback technique. Back to the kayak. So again, perpendicular is the ideal place to be. So we get them out to perpendicular. And the very next thing I'll do is I'll be typically on this side of the kayak, but what I get them to do is put this hand on their belly. And then from here, they want to take the paddle and bring it up to the chine, bring their head up, and load the kayak. So right now they're driving the kayak away from them. They want to load the kayak, so they're bringing the kayak into their belly, if you will. It's a lot more obvious if we actually have a kayak here. But then we're up like this. Does that make sense to everybody? So right now, I'm taking my legs from this position and I'm pulling the kayak literally into my belly. Okay? By doing that, by loading the kayak up like that, what it's doing is it's allowing me to get my face closer to the surface of the water. If I don't load the kayak up like that, my face will probably be about 3 feet under the water. If I load the kayak, I get my face really close to the center. Okay? There's some benefit to that. When I'm in that loaded position and I'm all tucked in, I'm in that tucked position, I want to be able to reach out on the surface with my hand. And if I'm tucked in like this, I can actually reach out on the surface with my paddle and get my paddle quite far away from the kayak in that tucked position. So I'm still tucked, but I'm reaching out with my hand, if you will. Still tucked. Okay, does everybody get that? Okay, so from this position, what I'm going to do is bring my other hand out and my head out, and as soon as I start pulling back on that paddle, I'm going to pull my head back with the paddle, and that's when I'm going to change my legs from the loaded position to the driven position. Okay? So I pull out, I initiate the pry, and I kick the legs very hard to open up the kayak, and I'll literally pop up to the surface if I use my legs effectively. Okay? If you use your legs very slowly, you'll just kind of float up to the surface. Okay? But if you actually pop those legs really hard, your whole body will go sort of like a cork, right back up to perpendicular. Is there any questions about that? Does that make sense? Okay, so one of the best exercises I believe that you can practice for layback technique is to go upside down into that tuck position, reach out and pop your body up as perpendicular as you possibly can back to a static brace position. You'll find when you try this the first time, you'll go upside down and pop yourself up to perpendicular and you'll actually be way back here. Most people will. They'll go upside down and they'll pop up and be like, I'm perpendicular, and they're actually way, way, way back here. So one of the exercises is to try to actually go from upside down back up to perpendicular. Because in theory, this is how you do the straitjacket roll. So all of the technique for the straitjacket roll is actually built into the butterfly roll. It's the same as the hand roll, the brick roll, all of the layback rolls are built into the butterfly roll. But the only effective way to do a straitjacket roll is to pop your body up perpendicular before you swing to the back deck. Where most people, again, are popping up here, and then you'll see them try to do a straitjacket, they'll just kind of get hung up on the back deck. It's because they haven't allowed their hips to open up enough in order to swing themselves to the back deck and effectively use your legs to bring yourself up and around. That makes sense to everybody? So generally, if somebody comes to me and they say, well, I want to work on my straitjacket roll, it's not very often I get people saying that. Yeah?
I do,
Do you?
absolutely.
So this is one of the things that I start with. I get people saying, I want to work on the straitjacket roll, and I say, well, guess what? Today we're going to work on butterfly rolls. And they're like, what? That doesn't make any sense to me. But you go right back to the basics. You refine the basics of the layback roll if you want to do the hardest roll on the list. That's exactly how you do it. Okay? So again, when you're upside down, if you load the kayak up, some of the benefits are you're going to get your face closer to the surface. Therefore, you can reach further out for leverage with your hand. And as you start to pull that paddle back, one of the things I said is you want to initiate the pry and then kick the leg. That's sort of a timing thing. You can pull back with your hand in your hand in your head and kick your leg at the exact same time, and it will be effective. But it's going to be more effective if you initiate the pry and then kick the leg, and it's kind of that quick. And the reason for doing that is if you initiate the pry, you're actually taking some of the weight of the kayak off. And as soon as you pull down, say your kayak weighs 50 pounds, once you start to pull down, you're taking some weight off the kayak. So let's say now it's 40 pounds, and if you kick it's obviously easier to kick 40 pounds than it is 50. Okay, so you get a much stronger kick with your legs, and you'll get more dramatic pop up to the surface if you initiate your pry before you kick your legs. That's a very difficult thing to learn if you're a brand new paddler. So it's better just to do it all at the same time while you learn, but realize that once you get further down the road, there is a timing to making it even more effective. No different than if you were throwing a baseball. Throwing a baseball, you know, there's that whip in the wrist, if you will. That's that same sort of timing technique that we're talking about. At first, you can only throw it so far, but once you practice this for a number of times, it starts to get better and better, and you figure out that whipping sort of motion, and that's very similar to rolling the kayak. Okay? So again, once you've popped your body up, if you were in a static brace position from upside down, right to the back deck, keeping the head nice and low, think about bumping your ear onto the side of the kayak or the chine of the kayak, and then on to the deck. Okay, so one of the last things to talk about with this is what is your setup position like when you go into this particular roll? I've seen a number of people holding on to their combing with both hands. So they're in this type of a position where they're sitting in the kayak and they're holding on to the combing on this side, and they're going into the roll like this, sort of falling in this way. Now that'll work, but one of the things that I teach is put your hand on your belly and pre-rotate your shoulders, if you will. So if I go in this way, that's one